Good morning, everyone. I'm Shah Osha. Welcome to the art lecture series. I want to remind you that after about an hour talk today, that we'll open it up for Q&A, and we want student and community participation with our speaker. So if you're on Zoom, you can, is that better?
Is that on?
Yeah, you can, if you're on Zoom, you can raise your virtual hand and we can hear you. We won't be able to see you for your question, or you can put your question in the Q&A. So please feel free to do that if you have any questions. And if you're here, we are also in person. We have a live audience in the recital hall. So those of you who are here can come down and just ask your question right into the camera. So good morning. Today we have Leah Modigliani. And I want to just remind us that we have two more lectures after today. In week 6, we have Victoria Idongesit Udon-Dian, and in week 8, we have Pam Lins, both visual artists doing sort of interdisciplinary art. So please join us for those. And so I'd like to introduce right now Jocelyn Haldeman, who will introduce Leah. Thanks.
Thank you, Shah. Hello, everyone. My name is Jocelyn Haldeman. I'm a senior at Evergreen. I'm currently enrolled in an independent learning contract with a small cohort of my peers, fellow art students. Together, we formed a supportive learning community in which we discuss shared readings and participate in weekly critiques and student-led workshops. The varied approaches to art making and art thinking in our cohort enriches our learning and each individual's creative practice. The Evergreen State College is one of the only places within higher education that supports such collective and interdisciplinary learning. And it is this interdisciplinary approach to art that makes me so excited to introduce our guest today. Leah Modigliani is an artist and a scholar. Her work weaves together art history, political history, and the history of activism to create moments of deep reflection. She demonstrates this reflection in her writing, which shows a profound willingness and curiosity about our modern world. In her book, Counter-Revanchinist Art in the Global City, Modigliani presents analyses of art left on walls and barricades across the world, from Ukraine to Mexico. In one of her solo exhibitions, she recontextualizes artifacts from 20th century protests around the world. In one area of the installation, a group of black hooded sculptures with white masks huddle in a mass atop a raised platform in the center of the room. This sculpture references a photo of a protest in Basel, Switzerland. I recognize and appreciate the global perspective present in this work. The careful selection, recreation, and recontextualization of these artifacts invites the viewer to take pause and reflect on a truly global history of political activism. So, I, for one, am excited to take in and reflect on what Leah Modigliani has to share with us today. Please welcome our guest artist, Leah Modigliani.
Hi, thank you so much to Shah and everyone at Evergreen for inviting me. I'm so happy to be with you and your interdisciplinary program, which is close to my heart, as you'll see. So I will share my screen and get started in a second. Here we go. You guys see that okay? Right. I just decided to open with this slide. This is a image from an installation I did here in Philadelphia. And I will tell you a little more about my background in just a second, but this is the opening slide is from an installation I did at a nonprofit artist-run gallery called Vox Populi here in Philadelphia in 2015. And it sort of sets the tone for some of the things I'll be talking about today. It is a kind of barricade. It's an artificial barricade that's a reenactment of a protest that anti-war protesters did at the University of Pennsylvania in 1972. And in this protest, they barricaded themselves inside what was the main administrative building of the university for more than a full day. I think they were in there about 2 full days while they negotiated with the administration with the goal of trying to get the university to disallow Army recruitment on campus, basically. So this gallery had a unique sort of spatial footprint because you could access the gallery from 2 sides, which allowed for me to bifurcate the space diagonally. And so viewers could enter on either side of the space to see or perhaps inhabit the perspective of those inside the building or those sort of on the other side of the wall. So I want to get back to this issue of space and barricade and sort of the politics of space throughout this talk. And to get there, I need to go back in time a little bit. I'm actually from your sort of neck of the woods, if you will. I grew up in Vancouver, which is the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. I'm dating myself, but I grew up in I grew up in the 1970s when the city of Vancouver looked more like it does on this left-hand slide, which to say it was still imagined as a kind of regional location with mostly low-rise buildings. And as the slide on the right indicates, the city has been radically transformed during my lifetime. And this has been a spectacular and sort of intellectual backdrop to much of the work that I do, seeing the development of the city from from the so-called, I forgot what they used to call Vancouver, but anyway, from this, sort of like regional location to what's now called the vertical city. And some architects actually called this phenomenon Vancouverism when applied to other types of cities that grow in height. So considerations of how the built environment in fact impact, and also how certain types of cultures impact the work we do, the work we see, how we imagine ourselves has been a consistent sort of theme of my work. So as the last slide and some of what I've just said indicates, there's some strategies that appear both in my art and writing, of which I do in equal measure. And these strategies have to do with foregrounding conflicts in space. Conflicts are not necessarily something bombastic like a fight or something violent. Conflicts can exist at the level of, the stories that we tell or the ways that certain kinds of histories are privileged over others. So they can be discursive kinds of conflicts. And this desire I seem to have had since I was a little kid to sort of transgress boundaries in some way, to sort of poke and prod at what's expected of one, to see if in fact that is true or real, to question like why things have always been done a certain way seems to be a kind of ongoing thread in my work. So transgressing boundaries, borders, and what are perceived to be normative histories, I think, are like reoccurring themes. I also I like to draw attention to alternative contexts, like these are spatial, discursive, sometimes temporal, different contexts for understanding objects, images, or stories. So always, looking at a subject from multiple viewpoints. And one of my favorite refrains as a teacher, I teach visual studies at Tyler School of Art and Architecture in Philadelphia, where I've been since 2013. And I'm always saying to my students, context, 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 for understanding the visual culture around us. You really it's not enough to just look, you also have to learn. You have to find out how something exists in time and space and how it got to be there, Another consistent theme is kind of a love of criticism. I see art critics or critics in general as being deeply engaged in a kind of love of the world, which I don't know if that's a normal way of thinking about art criticism, but I think that in order to critique something, you're investing a great deal of time and energy into trying to understand it and perhaps trying to think of constructive ways to make that thing better. And so I think that shows a deep kind of engagement with the world that I greatly respect. So I'm always, interested in criticism and interested in how criticism can indeed reveal these kinds of contexts for things that we might not have understood otherwise. All right, so I will be showing you guys a mix of, oh, wait a sec, sorry, my screen here, there we go. I want to talk about some of my writing and my artworks. And I'm going to start with, segueing from Vancouver, I want to talk about my first book, which was published in 2018 through Manchester University Press in their Rethinking Arts History series. And it is titled Engendering an Avant-Garde, The Unsettled Landscapes of Vancouver Photoconceptualism. And this is a book that, sorry, I need to go to that slide, not the other one. I jumped ahead of myself. This is a book that unpacks, if you will, the predominant type of art that I grew up with in Vancouver in the late 80s and into the early 90s, which was the so-called Vancouver School of Photoconceptualism. This had a big impact on me because it appeared to me as a young person. I started out going to the University of British Columbia, and it appeared to me that there was something deeply historical about this photography that I didn't yet have access to. So I was conscious of the ways that conversations were circulating about the photographer Jeff Wall's work and others that seemed really powerful, but at the time I was 17, 18 years old, I didn't really totally understand it yet. So this was a generative kind of seed that was planted to grow later into really a book that attempts to do a kind of discourse analysis of the art and writing of Vancouver artists and their supporters to try to examine why women artists were most often not included in this sort of moniker of the Vancouver School. So in the work, I engage with artists like Jeff Wall, Ian Wallace, Marion Penner Bancroft, Christos Dikikos, Roy Arden, Liz Magor is in the book. And I read through, and I did an enormous amount of reading about what the artists were saying about their own work and considering how that writing about their own work worked to sort of propel them into a specific history of European avant-garde, sort of like reimagined on the so-called frontier of the West Coast in Vancouver, and how this discourse, which even back in Europe in the early 20th century was very male-centered, how that kind of like worked again in this new environment to in a sort of discursive way exclude women from consideration in the history. So it's a kind of feminist critique of the Vancouver School of Photoconceptualism, and it taught me a lot about how knowledge is produced, how knowledge circulates, and what one can do as a critic to, again, reframe things that are taken a certain way, reframe new understandings of them. In the course of doing all of this research for Engendering an Avant-Garde, I came across this photograph by Jeff Wall, The Stumbling Block. It's one of his lesser known works. You may or may not know about Jeff Wall's work. He's known in the 80s and 90s, he was known for these large Cibachrome transparencies of spectacular scenes that were staged. They were huge sets that he constructed and then photographed. And in this one, we see a woman tripping over a man on a sidewalk in Vancouver. And the man laying on the ground it's hard to see probably for you guys, but he's in city gear. He's got the Vancouver city logo printed on him, and looks like he has a coffee cup there. So he's hanging out there on the sidewalk for an amount of time, right? And you see people tripping over him as they go by. I thought this was an interesting photograph, and I didn't didn't think a lot about, it didn't fit into other aspects of my book. So I sort of put it aside. And then sometime later, I read a really interesting essay by a geographer that that has been influential on my thinking, called Nicholas Blomley, who wrote a article called "Shut the Province Down: First Nations Blockades in British Columbia, 1984 to 1995." And in this text, Blomley explains that during the very time that this photograph was made, it would have been all over the news that there was a number of blockades happening on logging roads and things like that in British Columbia, in order to sort of force the province to come to terms with the unceded territories of First Nations people and their claims for land, for the right of their land, right? And so this was like kind of a profound moment for me in thinking through, like, could this photograph, whether intentional or not, actually represent that type of conflict in space? Jeff Wall himself has described this image as a kind of like black comedy, you know, that the tripping over the sort of administrative worker can function as, Jeff Wall called it, you know, the inauguration of change, which I really liked. But I was thinking about this in a more expansive way, to think about it as also a symbolic representation of sort of these broader political and geopolitical contests over space that were happening in the province at the time that this picture was being made, basically. So all of that to say that the research from this first book and then the thinking through this photograph really led to a whole other book, which was published last summer by Routledge in their Urbanism in the City series, Critical Studies in Urbanism in the City. And the title of the book, as you can see there, is Counter-Revanchist Art in the Global City: Walls, Blockades, and Barricades as Repertoires of Creative Action. So what, you know, again, I like to talk about how the one project leads to another project, right? Like when you're engaged in certain types of writing or practice-based outcomes, you know, this process, like creativity engenders more creativity. So for the students out there, you know, the more you do, the more you discover along the way. And it's like one of the beautiful things about art making, for sure, and writing. So I started with this question, like, what does it mean? What does it mean when artists purposefully shut down space? You know, like what happens when artists who are imagined to be the exemplars of freedom, so to speak, right? Like artists are imagined to be people who are kind of doing their own thing, or free from a lot of societal structures. A lot of that is mythology, but this is like the kind of symbolic idea of the artist, right? Like, so what does that mean when an artist actually creates an object that actually stops people or trade or whatever, stops people from going around doing their business, or it stops other types of movement? And that was like an idea that sort of lodged in me. And I began to think about, you know, what types of artworks I was interested in. And I pretty quickly realized that I was interested in artists and artworks that take up space in a kind of concrete way. So like sculptures or installations or performances, rather than, for example, two-dimensional representations of barricades or blockades or walls or such. Because I was interested in the action of literally having to make their viewer participants, if you will, go a different direction, right? So the book takes artworks as a subject, and artworks that function as blockades and barricades since the 1990s. And in studying the artist's work, I was curious about how those artworks might also function as representations of some of the geopolitical sort of inequities and, you know, troubles that are arising from this advanced state of capitalism we live in specific places. And through that research, I came to this term revanchism, which means a policy of seeking to retaliate, especially to recover lost territory. It comes from the old French word revanchiste, or revanche rather. And This is a word in critical geography that's been popularized by the geographer, well, David Harvey uses it a lot. It was really popularized by Neil Smith in the 90s. And let me just look at my notes for a second. Yeah, his work on the gentrification of the Lower East Side in New York in the 1980s around Tompkins Square Park. He also did a bunch of work on the gentrification of this neighborhood in Philadelphia called Society Hill. And in his work on gentrification, he came to this notion of revanchism, which for him was the idea that like cities and states might create laws that would make it impossible for certain type of people to go into certain types of spaces. So revanchism at the level of the city is the suggestion that punitive laws are in place that keep people sort of in certain neighborhoods. And what that allows for is for real estate to come in and sort of like, redesign neighborhoods for speculation, basically. So these ideas are starting to unify in this book. Other influences for the book are the history of artist barricades, of which one of my personal favorites is Christo and Jean Claude's work, The Iron Curtain, Wall of Oil Barrels, Rue Visconti, Paris, from 1961, roughly, where this was a little street in Paris where a number of galleries were, and they blocked off the street illegally. Actually, they didn't get a permit, so they just filled it up with oil barrels, and then in the early hours of the morning, and later had to take it down. And a lot of contemporary issues over borders that we're living through right now. This is a picture I find. Versions of this picture exist on the internet everywhere, and this is this weird floating barricade that the state of Texas has laid down in the Rio Grande, and it's being challenged by the federal government. There's a lot of politics and news media about this particular barrier, but many others exist. And what this kind of gets to is this idea that comes from discourses on border studies, that borders and boundaries and barricades and such are very often used politically in a theatrical kind of way to create controversy, or to create some sort of law, or to sort of stoke up ideology in some kind of way, but they don't often actually deter people. So the barricade is a kind of what I get into in the book is the idea of the barricade as a kind of repertoire, where a repertoire comes from performance. The notion of a repertoire comes from performance theory, where the actions, performative actions, or like things that are done outside of language and writing. So performative actions or cultural practices like cooking or singing or things like that are other ways of creating knowledge that can circulate outside of writing and language sometimes. And I see the barricade as a symbol that is repeated. It's a repertoire of kind of political activism that, even when it's not necessarily successful in terms of actually stopping people's movement or trades movement or what have you, that it functions symbolically to signal other kinds of things. So the performance, the border becomes a kind of performative strategy for engaging in conversation about other things. Yeah, okay. That's like my notes. So the book goes through a number of case studies. There's a couple of chapters that deal with some of the theory that I've been sort of loosely talking about: border theory, performance studies, political activism, what a public sphere is, how one intervenes in a public sphere to create kind of political awareness or consciousness in viewers, et cetera. And then it moves into these case studies. The first case is the work of the Chinese artist Lin Yilin, and his piece Safely Maneuvering Across the Linha Road, which he made in 1995 in Guangzhou, which is in the Pearl River Delta, in southern China. And In this chapter, I kind of talk about Lin's work as, so what he's doing there is it's a performance, and he creates this wall out of essentially cinder blocks. And over 90 minutes, he moves the left side of the wall, the column of bricks on the left. He carries them and puts them on the right, and he keeps doing that so that the wall, in the language of one critic, migrates across the street. So the word migration is important here because at this time it's the beginning really of this massive internal migration that's happening within China because of the rapid sort of investment in cities and infrastructure to cities. That means that people are coming from the outlying rural areas to work in the cities. So as Lin is building this wall and is slowly moving across the street, the building right behind him that's going up is what was going to be the tallest tower in Asia at the time, the CITIC Tower. And you can see a picture of it on the right there on this billboard. It was only the tallest tower in China for about 5 months, I think, because so many were being built at the time. But as Lin is moving across the street in the course of the video, these are still the right is a still image from the video. You see workers coming in, carrying stuff, and they're working on the building basically, which is rising above him. So the chapter deals with, talks about this performance. It talks about the changes in Guangzhou as a central sort of area in the Pearl River District. This was one of the first special economic zones that were opened up under the so-called opening and reform movement that began when Deng Xiaoping took power with the Communist Party at the end of 1978. And this is the beginning, the beginning of China's integration into sort of a capitalist, world order that is investing international investment really skyrockets in Chinese real estate and infrastructure. So he's right in the middle of it. And I think the piece is evocative of many things. I also get into his, how so-called avant-garde or contemporary Chinese artists were learning at the time how the opening and reform movement meant that they were accessing a lot of Western materials that they didn't have access to prior. There's a couple other shots. That's the CITIC Tower. In this right picture, this is the CITIC Tower. The pictures on the left are pictures I took when I went there in 2019. You can see how the street, it's impossible to do this work today. The street is constructed so that pedestrians can only walk across at certain junctions, which also has to do with the ways that urban spaces are designed to restrict or to control movement across them. Chapter 3 centers on the Spanish artist Santiago Sierra's work, Obstruction of a Freeway with a Truck's Trailer. And this is in Mexico City. He lived in Mexico City at this time. And this is a kind of performance artwork in which he hired a truck driver to park perpendicular, at right angles to this really busy ring road in Mexico City, the Anillo Periférico. So it's a ring road that was built to go around the city to also enable transportation in the construction of new sort of satellite cities within the city in the 1950s and 60s. And so he hires a truck driver to drive perpendicular to it and basically blocks off traffic. And again, it's documented through a video and it's very short, like 5 minutes, but in the 5 minutes, it's enough that the traffic really backs up behind the truck and the volume, the loud honking increases. And then just near the end, it's kind of beautiful. Like people, there's a couple you see there, but people start to come in from the side street and ride their bike through the open area. And you could see how quickly, if the traffic stopped, that people would come and sort of like repopulate or use this road in their own way, right? Importantly, the chapter also engages with this tower, which you can sort of see back here, although it's easy to miss. This tower is the Torre de los Vientos, which is one of 19 sculptures that were commissioned in 1968 under the sort of direction of the artist Matthias Goretz for what is known as Ruta de la Amistad, the route of friendship. The route of friendship was a series of large-scale concrete sculptures that were commissioned to be placed around the freeway near where the 1968 Olympics grounds were going to be. So it was called a cultural Olympiad, and these sculptures were meant to be viewed from the point of view of cars, basically, and that they were supposed to sort of draw one in culturally to the new modern Mexico state right before the Olympics. When Sierra did this work, he was responding to the curatorial program of the artist Pedro Reyes, who had sort of taken over the tower. The tower is actually, you can go inside the tower. This was the only sculpture out of the 19 that could be entered. You can't enter it anymore, it's closed up. But at the time you could go inside, and there was some built-in furniture and stuff on the inside. So Pedro Reyes started using this as a kind of ad hoc sort of curatorial program, and eventually it got funded and became, a number of artists participated in it. And as part of this curatorial program, he invited Sierra to do this work, and Sierra was the only one who did something outside of the tower. So the tower is an important part of my thinking, because the tower indicates a certain kind of like almost utopian modernist desire for this new Mexican state that by, the 90s certainly was, there was a lot of disillusionment in that by the 90s after the massacre that occurred in just the Tlatelolco massacre that happened with students before the 1968 Olympics, and then later NAFTA, and a lot of the problems with the devaluation of currency and all this kind of stuff that happened during the NAFTA era. So there's a lot of other things that I get into with the chapter. The next chapter deals with British artists Heather Peake and Ivan Morrison, and a couple of artworks they did that function as kind of barricades in public space. This is essentially a power dump a flower dump, pardon me, that they did in Bristol in 2006 that was titled "I Lost Her Near Fantasy Island, Life Will Not Be the Same." And they sent out these sort of wonderfully poetic little cards to people anonymously beforehand that said, "African gray parrot, gray with red tail, feathers, I lost her near Fantasy Island, life has not been the same." And nobody really knew what those meant. And then later, a week or so later, this dump of flowers just magically appeared in the city, and it was there all day. And by the evening, somebody reached in and took some flowers, and then the public started taking the flowers home in armfuls, and then the piece was over when the flowers had all dissipated. This was a project that was funded by the nonprofit group Situations, which was based in Bristol at the time, who commissioned a lot of public art projects over many years. And in this chapter, I get into talking about how this sort of orchestrated, artistic, spectacular kind of barricade also sort of ties into this sort of creative cities concept that is popularized in the 2000s by people like urban theorist Richard Florida and others. This is another project the same artist did in Wellington, New Zealand. Both of these projects happened over the course of one day. Like literally they were made overnight and they only lasted one day and then were dismantled. So they do kind of arise in the morning as some kind of like beautiful catastrophe, if you will. And indeed, this piece here in Wellington, which is down by the port in Wellington in a nice area, suggests almost like that the city has, that a disaster has happened, that a tsunami has washed in and dumped all this detritus there. All right, I need to speed up a little bit. I'm talking too much about my book. I have other things to show you. All right, the last chapter tracks the use of mirrors across several locations, from Euromaidan in Kyiv in 2013, where women protesters used mirrors, and they formed a line holding the mirrors up to the riot police to, in a sense, to try to reflect a kind of consciousness, to reflect a self-consciousness back at the police, basically, who were the same as them in some ways, right? This has its origins actually in the Greenham Common women's, well, I mean, maybe not its first origins, but an earlier, incarnation of this is the long protest encampment occupation of the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp that happened from 1980 all the way till 2000 actually, in Greenham Common in the UK. And there was a big evening protest there of almost 50,000 women who stood around the military base and held the mirrors up to the police that were on the other side of the base. In this case, the women were protesting the use of this space by Americans to house nuclear warheads, basically, which at the height of the Cold War marked the United Kingdom really as potentially as a preemptive strike. So the women were very concerned that the government had allowed these nuclear warheads to be sort of parked there without the consensus of the people, without asking the people in any way. And then in the same chapter, I move, I talk about Kyiv, I talk about the Greenham Common, and I also talk about Kanupa Hanska-Luger's initiation of a similar mirror piece that he called the Mirror Shield Project, which he acknowledges was inspired by the women at Euromaidan, like in Kyiv. And his Mirror Shield Project is a kind of social practice version of this, where like he created a video that showed people how to make these mirror shields out of stuff you can buy at Home Depot, basically a reflective film, sticky film, and masonite. And you can just get a sheet of masonite, you can cut it into so many pieces, stick the mirror, the reflective film on it, and then you can mail these to the North Dakota Access Pipeline protests where water protectors can use them. And so hundreds of people made these shields and sent them to water protectors, and they kind of did this, this was fairly well documented, but a beautiful performance. They used them also in a performance. And in this video that the artist gave me, I mean, this image that the artist gave me, you can see how not only do they function as sort of protective shields, but they're reflecting the sky back at the camera. So depending on how they're held, you can see the sky or the river or the snow reflected in these little squares, which gives the impression of unification of the natural elements with the people who are occupying the land. And of course, this is in protest against extractive industries and the dangers to the river that First Nations and their allies are concerned with protecting as kin. So I talk about this as the mirrors also being a kind of repertoire of social protest that is being used across different groups and communities around the world as a useful sort of material object that signifies some kind of conflict over a border or boundary that's in dispute. All right, now I'm going to really change direction. I wanted to, Jocelyn was talking about some sculptures that I made that unfortunately didn't put in this presentation. So I hope you forgive me for that, Jocelyn. But I want to talk about some other artworks that relate more to this concept of cities. And so this is a project I did I know, I feel like I just totally changed direction. So let me back up and say that I do these writing projects and I also make art, and they're really different. They're similar subjects, but they're different. They're different outcomes. They're different processes, but they mutually inform each other. And there's a kind of creative problem solving at play in both processes, but they're hugely rewarding, but they're very different. And you know, every artist takes a different path. For me, I went to art history. I came to art history and writing a little bit later. It wasn't something I did when I was younger. And actually for me, getting involved in writing and that kind of research was actually really liberating for my artwork. So I see more clearly now that the art does something, communicates in a way that's much different than writing. And it's really beautiful, and it has its own, it has its own way of communicating, you know? And so I do these, I'm never happy if I'm not doing both, even though I can't do both at the exact same time, but I kind of like vacillate between them. So this is a project that I did at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in 2017. It's the title of the exhibition was "The City and Her Desolation," and this exhibition had contained 6 artworks. They were there was a book that I made, which I'll show you, a couple of prints, and a couple of photographs, and a large relief sculpture. And the installation centered around the images of these 2 neoclassical sculptures. On the left is Jerusalem, which was created by William Wetmore Story in 1873. And on the right is one called Deborah from it was also made in 1873. They were made the same year, actually. They were made specifically to be unveiled at the inauguration of the new, what is now called the historic building, the Frank Furness designed historic building. That's the museum. And I was invited to come and, kind of look through the archives and create artwork about what I found there. And I came to the project without a lot of preconceived notions. And what I found through digging around in the archive was this amazing narrative about these 2 statues, basically. Here's just an overview of the exhibition. So the first thing that I found was the story of Jerusalem. She is, although unveiled as like the height of successful art in 1876, by 1949, her and the other sculptor were marked for deaccession by the museum. Basically, the museum had decided that they had too many things and they couldn't store them all, and they got a committee on collections together to decide, what needed to be deaccessioned and what they would keep. And a number of neoclassical sculptures were marked for removal, basically. And some of the reasons given for this was that they were literally no longer in style. Like you can imagine, right? By 1949, we're in the height of modernism. These kinds of sculptures would not seem contemporary anymore. So the museum essentially gave away the sculpture to a patron who owned a cemetery, and she was relocated to a cemetery. So this is a photograph I found in their archives that I enlarged of her in the cemetery. And as the pictures on the left indicate, at a certain, the sculpture started to degrade in the cemetery. It wasn't made for outdoor use. And let me just go ahead. And this one, Deborah, was actually destroyed. The sculpture was destroyed. They couldn't find someone to take it. It had some damage in 1937, and because of that, perhaps it was finally destroyed. So this sculpture doesn't exist anymore. But around 1976, so the centenary of the original inaugural building opening, the curator and the director of the museum discovered that from a local art historian, that the best sculpture they ever they had given away. And to their credit, they became very interested in reclaiming the statue of Jerusalem, and thus embarked upon a rather epic tale. It went on till 86, basically 10 years, they worked hard to get the sculpture back from the owners, the new owners. Finally, they got the sculpture back. And then, as the pictures on the left show, they had to spend 6 years conserving it, basically fixing it, because it had cracks, there was plants growing in it, all kinds of stuff. So they did a beautiful conservation job, and now it sits in a prominent place back in the museum. I was very interested in these historic figures of Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, and the prophet or judge Deborah. This is, I'm making this work in the fall of 2016 and the spring of 2017. And there had just been a new election, and Trump had been elected, and there was a lot of news about the isolationism of the United States and America first and all this kind of stuff. And I became really interested in the sort of personification of the destroyed city. On the base of Jerusalem, the artist Story had carved into the base of Jerusalem in Latin this part of the Bible, Lamentations. He carved Lamentations in the bottom of the statue. So it says, "How does the city sit alone when she was once so full of people? How like a widow is she who was once great among the nations and a queen among the provinces, now become a slave. She weeps alone at night with tears upon her cheeks. All her lovers are gone and none can comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her and have become her enemies." So I just thought that was a really powerful narrative, and it said a lot about the loneliness of a city. I feel it's a sort of personification of a lonely city. She is sitting on the edge of a broken wall, basically, which is representative of the destruction of Jerusalem historically. And this kind of idea of the personification of the female figure as America is a long standing image in American art, right? So I had this text sort of, I manufactured a sculpture, a relief sculpture that was literally embedded into the wall. It's carved, it's laser cut, not laser cut, but cut MDF basically to look like, you can sort of see in the top right there, to look like the letters are carved into the wall. And that is supposed to have the look of a monumental kind of statue, like the Lincoln Memorial or something like that. And that sort of serves, and it's white, so it's hard to photograph, sort of blends into the background. It functions as a sort of cautionary tale in the space of the installation. And obviously there's a freestanding frame for Deborah, so she actually looks over at Jerusalem. So there's this sort of imaginary interpersonal thing going on between them. Another important component of this work was a book that was very consciously modeled in a way after Ed Ruscha's conceptual art book, Every Building on the Sunset Strip from 1967. This is called The City and Her Desolation. It's a 15-foot long panorama of cities destroyed by war from about the American Civil War until recent. And the pictures were taken mostly from the internet, a couple archives, and scanned, and they were through Photoshop digitally linked together into one long panorama. And so there's a little bar at the bottom that tells sort of roughly where the pictures are from. It's not meant to look very realistic. It sort of alludes to the history of collage and all those kinds of things, but these are all cities destroyed by warfare. And no one is really given special weight. They're all equally disastrous, with the exception perhaps of Hiroshima, which is in the center. So that is the center, sort of the worst case scenario at the center of the book. So that is one of the other works in that installation. How much time do I have left? 20. Okay, I'm good. So in recent years, my artwork, even though I have a much longer history of doing sculpture and installation, I've been more and more engaged with photography. And well, I don't call myself a photographer, but obviously a lot of my work is interested in photography. This is another work I did, which was last shown at the Colby Museum of Art. And it's a long, again, a kind of panorama. I think about it being kind of a skyline of images of people who have been evicted from their homes. So this is a work that deals, obviously, represents housing insecurity. And the picture, starting from the left to the right, the pictures go from around 1933 to or early 30s to 1999. Obviously, you can see that they're divided into the front and the back of the photographs. A color picture. How long can we tolerate this? The title comes from the back of one of the earlier pictures, which I have a close up here. You can see that it says, it's a picture of William Barber and his family. It says, when William Barber was evicted from his home in Anderson, Indiana, he moved all of his belongings onto the courthouse lawn and set up housekeeping there with his family. He refused charity or assistance, and it's said to have been it is said to have even turned down an offer of a steady job. Anderson officials have found that it will take an order of the county board or commissioners to remove him from the property. Barber, his wife, and their baby are shown above in their new home. So there's a few things at stake here. One is thinking through how, more broadly, housing insecurity, which is a problem that never seems to go away. Disinvestment in communities. I became very interested in not only what was said on the back, these are all press photographs, so they're from the news, right? So how did the news represent these kinds of, how does news media represent these kinds of social problems? And how are they spoken about? The captions on the back became as interesting as the images. And so there's a kind of, at Colby, an anthropology class came in to look at this, and they really were the ones that showed me how important the writing on the back was. I mean, I'd intuitively known it was important because I made the work that way, but they thought it was interesting how the people were discussed in the captions on the back. And there's also stylistic changes in the photographs that are quite interesting. So, for example, after the Second World War, with the eviction pictures, there's this tendency to show the so-called nuclear family as a unit performing in a way this family role out on the street with their stuff in front of the apartment building that they've been evicted from. Like, they set up a scene where they're all eating breakfast at a table. There's another one where they set up a scene where it looks like the wife is washing laundry. So it's very interesting, like the desire to sort of show, just to stage the scene in a way to create an empathetic, perhaps, response in some way. In the 1970s, the pictures show they're taken from the camera is shooting upwards at people and at buildings. So there's a different angle happening. They're dark, they're literally darker. They seem to represent, in a way, more of this sort of film genre that we're used to seeing, the black and white films from that time period, which are a little grittier. So these are stylistic conventions that also come to bear on how we think about the scene. Okay, so this, I think, is the last series I'm going to talk about, which is my most recent artwork that I made after thinking through the last two pieces, basically, that I was showing you. And this is a series of images called City of God, or collectively Cities of God. And they are also digital collages that have two main components. One is that there's a kind of spherical orb at the center of the pictures, and that is a thing called a micrometeorite. And micrometeorites are kind of like space dust. They are tiny, tiny, tiny meteorites that fall down from space and land here on Earth. And I've collaborated with this guy, Scott Peterson, who collects these. And that's Scott up there in the top image. And people like him generally find these the best place to find these micrometeorites are on these flat roofs, these white vinyl flat roofs. And they go there and they collect the little bits of stuff around the drains, and then they have a process of sifting and washing the stuff they get there to figure out what are actually micrometeorites. And the final stage is they look at them on a microscope. So these are the orbs are scanned electron microscope images of these micrometeorites that are almost too small to see with the naked eye. Not quite. They're smaller than a grain of sand, though. Like, they're not something that you can see the details of with your eyes, basically. So taking those images and building onto them these kind of magical or surreal, perhaps, scenes of cities that have been reconstructed imaginatively out of their destroyed fragments. So in this case, I'm back to thinking through disasters and catastrophes, but these are disasters and catastrophes of urbanization or the built environment that are happening through weather events, really, like climate change. They're natural disasters. So in this work, I was trying to fuse a number of ideas, some having to do with just the impossibility of getting your head around the scale of the climate disaster. So there's an issue of scale here, something so large that you can't even imagine, and also something so small. When I say so small, of course, I'm thinking about the micrometeorites, but I'm also thinking about the scale of us in the universe, right? Like, we're so small, and the universe is so large that you can't actually rationalize it in any way. But when a weather event happens and you're suddenly caught in the middle of it, and I think almost everyone here has probably at this point experienced some version of this, even if not catastrophic, that it suddenly becomes very real. So I don't know, these are ideas I was trying to put into these pictures, and they also obviously reference science fiction. They have that kind of that look of that genre. The backgrounds are from NASA images, and the cities are constructed out of fragments of destroyed cities that I've got either from historical archives or from the internet. So this is one titled San Francisco, 1906. This is one from Kotor, Montenegro from 1979, from an earthquake there. This is a representation of Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, 2005. In Haiti, Port-au-Prince, 2010. Japan, Sendai, 2011. In China, Sichuan, 2008. Oh, well, I'm almost out of time. I'll just say that especially because there's students here, that, one project, again, it begets a new project, right? So now I'm interested in the failure of tall buildings. This is my new project, and I don't know where it's going exactly yet, but I'm interested in the sort of psychic anxiety that many people, and we seem to have culturally, for tall buildings. And of course, this is related back to, the Vancouver skyline for sure, but other work that I've done. I've been doing a lot of reading of fiction having to do with disasters happening in high-rise towers, and thinking through how the British novelist J.G. Ballard's sort of prefigurative imagination for the disaster of a high tower in London in 1975 is represented in a different way through the Grenfell disaster from 2017. and how artists like Chris O'Feely and Steve McQueen are depicting Grenfell in their artworks. So this may or may not turn out to be a new book project. I don't know. At the moment, I've just been doing a lot of reading about this and thinking about this stuff. So I think I better stop there. I think it's been about an hour. Should I stop sharing, you guys? What do we do now?
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna just have you hear the applause from this live audience. So. That was just totally fascinating, and I feel like it's so historically timely, like we are continuing to bomb cities and and have these
no,
we keep building and bombing and building and bombing, and then we also have natural disasters and from climate change, and then so you're dealing with this, like, this scale of history and the future and time quite poignantly.
yeah. I can't even read it all. I mean, I'm trying to stay on top of the news, but it's, I talk about this with friends sometimes, like you can't, you know, if you have the privilege to disengage at times, you almost need to, because it's so terrible, you know, like, yeah.
Yeah. And also, but it's like poignant and melancholy, and also there is the rebuilding, the amazing kind of rebuilding that happens over and over, of all those cities that you showed in that accordion sort of Richer kind of book. Yeah, that's happened, you know, decades ago, and there's now rebuilding. So I want to open it up to student questions, if we have any, either in the Q&A or hands, or from the people that are here. Anybody have any things they want to discuss? Yeah, would you just come down if you have a question, please? And I'm hoping that if a hand is raised, I will see it. So just move this down here. If I don't see it, Raoul, will you just notify me? Oh, great. We've got lots of questions here. So first person, step on up.
Hello. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, hi.
Hi. Okay, hi, I'm Elle. And I see a lot of, like, in your work, I feel like the motif of like a bombed city or like a ruined city. And you talked a little bit about the privilege of being able to disengage from something like that. And I was just curious, like, how you like empathize with the peoples whose homes like are bombed in your work. You know what I mean? Like, as you said, like coming from a position of privilege, like where do you find yourself like connecting with that into like a form of solidarity versus just like a bombed city? I like using it in my work.
Yeah, well, I think the work is focused on, you know, Shaw kind of suggested it, but there's this term in urban studies and architecture called creative destruction. So there's kind of an emphasis on what I'm really interested in is with the work is the ways that I think capitalism is invested in real estate. It's like the primary place that capitalist accumulation happens is in real estate. And so the bombing of cities is it's not only about a kind of like, you know, territorial dispute or religious dispute or whatever. It's also about, it's a way that frankly, companies can profit from going into those places and rebuilding. So there's an element of that is reflected a lot in the writing that I do. The ways that I don't know that you can, I don't know how deeply you can empathize with a very, very violent situation without actually being there. So the empathy for me comes out in small ways, having to do with choices that I make, like I don't depict any bodies in any of that work that you saw. So there were bodies in some of the images that I showed you, but I took them out digitally because I do feel like that's where some of my personal ethics comes across, that the focus is on the destruction of the built environment and not on real human people that are destroyed in the process. So there's these small ways that the decisions that you can make as an artist hopefully reflect some of your values, but the empathy is something that's personal. It's not, like, unless you're there, like how can you understand? Again, it's about the scale, right? Like, how do you understand the gravity of that situation without being there? We see it on the news, and it's like it all becomes a kind of spectacle at a certain point. And I don't show those pictures myself. I don't circulate those pictures myself. I see them, but so I don't know. It's a difficult thing to answer. I think it's like you have to, for me, I just try to take responsibility for the images that I put out there. And I try to call attention to situations in a kind of narrative form or a poetic form, at least in the artwork, that is suggestive of these problems without sort of taking advantage of real victims, like, I don't know how else to put it. Yeah, but that's what my response would be.
Yeah. Sweet. Thank you.
Sure.
Shoot.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Griffin. A lot of my artwork is also about like urbanism in cities and non-physical barricades, but I focus a lot more on like American and Canadian cities, and I noticed that you have a lot of stuff about international cities, so I'm kind of curious as to what like calls to you about those versus cities over here, and like why you choose to depict a lot of that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, so the sort of relates to the last, there's a connection to the last question, which has to do with, I see like what's going on around the world is globally connected. And so the artwork that I focus on in my writing and the things that I make are often case studies that come from some kind of local situation. Like, like the first book about photography in Vancouver, I did an enormous amount of research about stuff happening in Vancouver and like articles written in the newspapers in Vancouver in the 60s and 70s and 80s and stuff, right? But then you need to zoom out and look at what's happening on a global scale, because we live in a time where like the financial world and the financialization of real estate and urban design and all of that is connected. So you don't have any urbanization going on in any given place in the world that isn't actually funded by some other place in the world. So it's actually at a neoliberal capital level, it's all connected. So what I'm interested in doing is, and what I did in the last book, is try to see how specific things happening in specific cities are resulting from a combination of local or regional factors and a greater sort of global systemic system. So by making sense of what the factors are at the broader sort of global level, you see how it comes into contact with like the artist real life, right? So like how the artist was trained, what they had access to, like how much money it cost them to produce this work. Like, in Lynn's case, like he had to create that performance on the street in Guangzhou at exactly 12 p.m. because the traffic police would be out there any other time of the day, but he noticed that they went to lunch from 12 to 1:30. And so he could only do that work in that hour. And that's super interesting. Like, that's like, he could only make that work with this conscious, like, problem solving that has to do with the cops in the city being on the beat because they're in charge of cleaning up the city, because at a larger level, there's a global, like, sanitary city campaign going on where people aren't supposed to be doing that kind of thing on the street.
Right.
So it's a little bit of a tangent, but, you know, I think it's super interesting. Like, what's going on in other places is actually interconnected with us in ways that we don't really imagine, you know. And Vancouver it's a Canadian city, but you know what? That place was transformed in the 80s and 90s through international investment, just like all the other vertical cities around the Pacific Rim. So to understand one, you do have to sort of look into the others, you know?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
back. And what I wanted to ask was, in the series, How Long Can We Tolerate This? The eviction notices and such. I was wondering if in your research you noticed any sort of change in the language they use to describe like the typical nuclear family versus like maybe individuals, or I'm trying to think of how I can formulate this question. I think I'm just interested in how the language changed between like the typical nuclear family where they weren't like necessarily threatened by their presence of like having all their stuff on the street and like eating breakfast and such, and then sort of the attitude around houseless folks and eviction nowadays, and sort of like, I don't know if that made sense.
Well, well, I don't want to evade the question, but it's been a while since I like read through all the backs. So I don't know how fresh my memory is. It was a while ago I made that piece, but there's definitely like these shifts. I did look at mortgage crisis stuff from after the mortgage crisis around 2008, right? And there was a lot of images of here in the United States of displaced people, right? And the images were very different. It was actually very interesting because a lot of what we saw then was suburban housing situations, which is not the case in those other pictures from earlier decades. So because of the ways that the subprime mortgage crisis affected housing, it was really like, it was these suburban houses that people were suddenly being evicted from. So those pictures, which aren't in the piece, but you know, I did look at, were pretty interesting because, you know, they're pictures of a house in the background with a suburban street and all this stuff on the lawn. And it's very different than the dense kind of urban cities that are in the earlier work. There's a kind of like reportage style of language that's used in a lot of these press photos. That's definitely different in earlier decades than it is today, because now you have the internet and now you have like these pictures and you have captions. Like if you look at the Getty pictures, there's a basic caption, but you're generally going to have like a longer piece accompanying the picture. So you don't really get that kind of like style of reporting the incident anymore. They tended to be pretty matter of fact. There wasn't stylistically a big difference between how they were referring to families versus single people.
Mhm.
You know, they were, I didn't notice a lot of, you know, sort of social bias in them, to be perfectly honest. Even though one might expect that, I didn't really notice that. But I didn't look at all of the ones that ever existed. So there probably are some like that. So I don't know. I don't know if that's even answering your question. I'm sorry. But
No, absolutely. Thank you.
sure.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Jocelyn. Thank you so
Hi.
much for your lecture today. I really enjoyed it.
Hi.
I noticed that like context is always present in your work. Like you provide a lot of context, whether it's in the artwork and like in a lot of the naming of the pieces, you know, or like places and dates, and in your writing, you like you talked about this a little, but you like attach what's happening locally to what's happening on like a more global scale. And I was wondering how you, so for your artwork, how do you approach like the context of like the gallery or the museum, which can so often like, those are like institutions that can be a part of, that are just like naturally a part of like the kinds of issues you make your work about, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
gentrification and capitalism and real estate and all those things.
Oh yeah, it's like I didn't have time to get into it, but like absolutely. I mean, the art world, art communities, art culture, the cultural realm, all these ways of putting it are deeply integrated with things like gentrification, right? I get into that a little bit in one of those chapters, the chapter in the book that deals with Peak Morrison's barricades, because they're being commissioned specifically by city agencies, like being paid to produce those works, which are really kind of like
Mm.
as part of like festivals in a way that are meant to attract people, right? And generate interest in certain cities. So that's a very good example of how a political image of a barricade is actually somewhat apolitical, because it's actually being used to create interest in tourism or whatever you want to call it, right? On a
Mm.
personal level, like showing in galleries and museums, yeah, it's complicated. I mean, one should never be naive about what that is and what that means. There's lots and lots of critiques going around in recent years about all of the, compromised ethics of certain museums and galleries and their boards and so on. There's plenty of social media threads dealing with that. So I think we need to all be aware of that and be mindful of it. And yet, these institutions, more positively, all these institutions are made of people and they are able to change, so that's a more hopeful way to look at it. I have a strange relationship to showing in gallery. I feel that I have a very peculiar, not peculiar, but particular situation, because I actually don't have a dealer. Like I don't really, I don't engage much with the commercial art market. For no particular, well, with some particular reasons, I didn't try that hard to ever get a dealer. And I don't make work that is often super sellable. Like those recent pictures are some of the most sort of beautiful things I've made. I don't really engage too much in the so-called art market. I have a lot of ambivalence about the art market, actually, the commercial art market. So I'm very lucky to be, sort of have an aptitude for academic research and writing and teaching, so that is what pays my bills. So I don't really have to worry about how often I show or to be on like a cycle of exhibiting work. And what I tell young artists is like, there's lots of ways to be an artist. And I think that people can recognize the commercial art world and some of the problems with how institutions are funded and so on. They can understand how they work pragmatically, and you can still find your creative people. So we are all creative people, so we can find ways to show our work and to make our work and support it through other means. You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, you just go in with your eyes open,
Absolutely. Cool. Thank you. And also just, this isn't a question. I just wanted to thank you for the Critics Manifesto that I like read on your website. I think as a, like
Oh,
a writer
cool.
and an artist, I thought that was really beautiful. So thank you.
Oh, thanks for saying that. Yeah, sure.
All right. I just wanted to go back to the question about how the houseless are perceived over time, and how when the state doesn't protect the people. Because I did some work around the Hoovervilles and thinking about how that's so different from what we are experiencing particularly on the West Coast. The houseless
Yeah.
situation here is impossible to ignore, and it definitely strikes some of the same population, but in very different conditions than it did in the Depression. And I think so. I think that was a great question, and sort of how the public views how it feels compassion towards those that are suffering from the society or symptomatic of society's ills. So I think that, yeah, is a good question over time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, thank you for also talking about the idea of the repertoire and thinking, that one piece where they're getting funded by the city to do what would be some kind of possible obstructionist kind of work, but it's been brought into a more entertainment. It sort of gets used up in that way. I mean, not that that's a compromise on the part of the artist, but just to be aware of what it's a slippery thing from bringing to consciousness one thing and then becoming something of entertainment on the other hand. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's back to space, like there's less and less true public space, it's all privatized basically. So when we have, and the idea about revanchism, where laws are created to keep people in and out of certain spaces, they apply to the things that at least Americans normally understand to be like sort of like sacred freedoms, like the freedom to protest, the freedom to vote, all these kinds of freedoms. But we have to really be careful how we think about that, because if you have laws that say, well, you can only protest if you get a permit, or, you can only make a barricade if you have a permit or whatever, it's like, then how much freedom do you really have, right? That's like you said, slippery ground. So I think that's something that I think a lot about as well. To live back, to the issue of eviction and homelessness is it's a result of, I mean, I don't have a solution for it myself, but I mean, it's obviously a result at some level of this sort of gentrification run amok and disinvestment in many different types of what in the lingo sometimes called, social welfare, but just society at large, right? Like disinvestment in society, or what the economists call our social reproduction of life, so that people here can't even work one full-time job and make enough money to pay rent. I mean, I saw that in the news the other day that like some enormous, percentage of Americans can't afford rent anymore, basically across all of these cities. So this is, symptomatic of just a very unsustainable system, which really wants to prioritize growth at the expense of life, really. And that's why I think that paying attention to the local matters, but because sometimes you can affect change at a local level, but understanding how that fits into a global system is just super important to understand as well,
Yeah, and that goes back to your most recent book about borders and how we keep, and on the one hand, cities are all global. I mean, they are that investment in that verticality of cities is coming from all kinds of different countries, right? It's not just in the city. Yeah, it's very global, that commerce. And at the same time, borders are being erected more and more and more to keep the actual people from moving and migrating out of political or environmental need. Yeah. So
I think that's like a central contradiction that was interesting in the book. It's just like the rhetoric around neoliberalism is that it crosses all borders and it's all about freedom and freedom from regulation, and all this kind of stuff. But at the level of the ground, there are like boundaries being set up everywhere you turn. So it's really like, it's a kind of rhetoric that doesn't play out actually at the level of real human lives at all, So I think that's something to be really aware of when, you know, oh, it's great, like you can invest your money all over the world and do this and that, but this another aspect of that system is that you will find your movements restricted in many other ways, you know.
Yeah. Any last questions? All right. I just really want to thank you for bringing these large concerns up and next to and with both writing and criticism. I think that that is an incredibly important distinction to make, that to look critically is to sort of have hope, I think, is to believe that there are ways that we can do better. So I love that framing, but also to bring the practice of art into the thinking of these concerns that we have and share. So I just really appreciate you bringing those things together and for coming to us.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me. This was a pleasure. Thanks.
Okay.